Anytime you start talking about coronavirus, there is at least one person who will bring up Sweden, and this person will say something like this. Sweden did not do a lockdown, and look, their numbers aren't that bad. Their death numbers aren't that bad, and they don't have a high death toll, etc., etc. And the person who says this is always going to be a right-winger. It's like clockwork. 100% it's a right-winger saying something like this. And it doesn't really surprise me because right-wingers love to praise Scandinavian countries, and they'll say stupid things like, well, if only the Vikings could come back, we would have no migrants. And here again, we see right-wingers praising a Scandinavian country, and this time it is Sweden. And they'll say Sweden didn't do a lockdown, and they don't have all the deaths, the high death numbers and all that stuff. And Sweden's neighbors, Denmark, Finland, Norway, they have done lockdowns as a response to coronavirus. Now let's look at the numbers. Let's look at the death numbers in Sweden's Scandinavian neighbors. Denmark, 563 deaths. Denmark has done a lockdown. Norway, 235 deaths. Norway has done a lockdown. Finland, 307 deaths. Finland has done a lockdown. Now let's look at Sweden. Sweden so far has over 4,000 deaths. Let's go through that quickly again. Denmark, Norway, Finland. These are Sweden's neighbors. They have all done lockdowns. Denmark, 563 deaths. Norway, 235 deaths. Finland, 307 deaths. Now, of course, it's always tragic when people die, but those numbers are a lot less than over 4,000 and counting. So can we please, for the sake of your own intellectual integrity, stop bringing up Sweden? I mean, really, it is so freaking annoying. And there is another guy. It just makes you guys look really, really dumb. But, you know, right-wingers I want to be nice to you guys. I'm going to try to be nice to you guys. There is a guy from Sweden that the right wing are praising, not just in Sweden, but all over the world. The right wing, they are praising this guy. His name is Anders Tegnell. Anders Tegnell. This is the head epidemiologist of Sweden. Essentially, he is the Anthony Fauci of Sweden. And this guy was interviewed recently by BBC's Hard Talk. And I must say, the interviewer for this episode did a really good job in just hitting this guy with good, solid questions. Good, solid questions. And I want to play you guys some clips from this interview. Before that, I'll give you a little bit of an explanation of the clips. So in this interview, the interviewer confronts Tegnell about the high death rate in Sweden, saying, hey, you know, your Scandinavian neighbors, so far they don't have the high death toll that Sweden has. They did quarantine measures. They did mitigation measures to prevent this disease from killing too many people, this virus from killing too many people. Sweden, and he says 3,000, but you know now it's over 4,000. But nonetheless, he says, you know, Sweden has had over 3,000 deaths so far. Are you proud of this? And this Tegnell guy says, well, no, it's regrettable, but and then he says, but most of the people who've died, they are, you know, old people, you know, sick people, you know. And he doesn't care. He claims, well, I regret it, I'm sorry. And then the interviewer says, well, do you feel any sort of shame? Do you feel any sort of guilt, any sort of sense of accountability for the deaths that your policy has done? And he says, well, you know, it's not just me. There's another guy there, you know, he's another guy. And he does the whole Nazi strategy of, well, when you get caught, just blame the other guys. And he says, it's just, you know, the elderly and the sick who are dying, basically. Who cares? Let those people die. Play the clips.
Is not the brutal truth that you have had many more deaths in Sweden than you would have had if, like your Scandinavian neighbours, you had imposed an early and very strict lockdown policy?
I think that's very difficult to know. I mean, the death toll in Sweden is mainly in the long-term facilities for long-term ill elderly people.
Can you regard a situation in which your country has getting on for 30,000 infections of COVID-19 in the population, has a death toll which is significantly higher than your neighbours, standing at around 3,500? Can you regard that as success, or do you have to acknowledge that in some ways your strategy failed?
Yeah, no, that's true. When it comes to the death toll, this didn't work out.
The point is really about comparisons with your Nordic Scandinavian neighbours, because they took a very different approach. They were much stricter in their lockdowns, as you've acknowledged. And the death tolls, well, Denmark just over 500, Finland just over 200, Norway just over 200. They are strikingly different from Sweden's. And the point really is that they now feel that they're in a position to ease their strict lockdowns, to bring some sense of normality back to their populations. And to quote one of the senior ministers in Denmark, they feel that there's very little chance of a second spike in infections because of what they've achieved. So they're as far along the curve as you are, but they've prevented hundreds and hundreds of deaths that you failed to prevent.
But I don't really understand what you mean that they're as far along the curve as we are. Obviously, they are not. If only like 1 or 2% of the population has been infected, they are not very far along any kind of curve.
But they're very confident that because of the measures that they took and the social distancing and the public consciousness that they now have, that the disease will not spread and will not kill the numbers that have been killed in Sweden.
Yeah, and only the future can tell.
Let me, if I may, get a little bit personal with you. I said earlier you became seen as the sort of architect of a maverick policy which went against the grain of the scientific consensus in many other parts of the world, where scientists were backing very strict mandatory lockdown. It did put you in the spotlight, not just in Sweden, but right around the world. And as the death toll has mounted in Sweden, and you've been very open about that, how has that affected you personally? Do you feel any sense of personal responsibility for those lives lost?
I mean, this is not my decision or anything like that. We are a big agency. I have my director who backs this whole thing.
Yeah, but I think you're a modest man, but I think you would accept that much of the groundwork and the strategy and the thinking behind Sweden's policy came from you. And it does seem to me that that's quite a burden for you to bear when we see what has happened.
I mean, of course, this death toll is highly regrettable.
So what do we get from this? What do we get from this? Conservatives, right-wingers, they love to say, well, coronavirus isn't that big of a deal because, well, it only kills the elderly and it only kills sick people. And what does that remind us of? I mean, conservatives love talking about the history of eugenics, but they love talking about it in the context of exposing progressives and Democrats. Like, progressives and Democrats, they're the eugenists. We're not. We're the good Christian folk. But here you have conservatives, you have right-wingers in both Western Europe and in the United States saying things like, well, it's just the sick and the elderly who are dying, essentially, who cares? Basically saying we shouldn't really do anything to help these people. If they die, their immune systems are weak, they're elderly, yada, yada, yada. I, as a young person, shouldn't have to do anything to really help these people. I, as a young person, shouldn't make any sort of sacrifices from the lifestyle that I'm so accustomed to in order to protect these people. And we hear stuff like this, especially online. You know, why do I, as a young, strong person, have to give up some of my rights to help someone who's just, elderly and they lived their lives anyway? You had a good run, Grandma, but, you're going to get coronavirus. Who cares? No mitigation measures, no lockdown, nothing. Conservatives, they just want everything to be free for all. Basically, no sense of community, no sense of people collectively, getting together and to help each other out as a nation, as a country, to prevent this virus from killing thousands of people, over 100,000 people. There's no sense of community. That's the problem. Like in America, you can go to a foreign country and you can see people talking to one another. You see neighbors talking to each other, people having coffee, going to the plaza, having a good time, getting together. In the United States, neighbors don't talk to each other. In America, there is no sense of community. New Zealand has lowered their coronavirus death toll tremendously. Like like New Zealand has, I want to say they've flattened the line, and New Zealand had very strong anti-coronavirus measures. New Zealanders, they have enough sense of a community to get together and to protect the nation from this virus. Americans, it's like, every man for himself sort of thing, and it's very, very sad. But here's another thing. Is in Darwinism, it's survival of the fittest. If you die, you die. You basically deserve it. You're weak, and your immune system is weak. You're old. Who cares about you? It's survival of the fittest. These right-wingers are essentially saying, yeah, we've had all these deaths, but it's mainly elderly people, so who really cares? That's essentially what people are saying. And that is social Darwinism. Congratulations, conservatives. You have gone the way of the progressives that you claim to hate so much. And another thing also is this obsession with the idea of herd immunity. We have to get herd immunity. Conservatives will say things like this. Right-wingers will say things like this. Herd immunity. They love using this term. And I understand that it is technically a scientific term that epidemiologists will use. But I find it disturbing that people who love to reference George Orwell's Animal Farm as some sort of a book, a prophetic book that gives us an idea of the future, will use this term, herd immunity. And you will find people who will quote George Orwell's Animal Farm as if it's holy gospel. And these same people are saying we need to get herd immunity as if we're a bunch of animals in a farm. Here is another thing that I want to lay out in this video. Sweden is one of the, if not the most eugenist country on earth. It's either one of the most eugenic countries on earth or the most eugenic country on the face of the earth. Sweden started its eugenic policy in the early 1920s, before Germany went Nazi. Sweden did not end its eugenic policy until 1971. A lot of you guys were alive then. Your parents were alive, at least. 1971. And here you have the head epidemiologist of Sweden saying, yeah, we've had all these thousands of deaths, but who cares? Yeah, our Scandinavian neighbors actually did responsible mitigation measures. Yeah, their death tolls are a lot lower than us, but who cares? It's just old people and sick folks dying. And this is the head epidemiologist of a country that did not end its eugenic policy until 1971. And you still have eugenic policy in Sweden. Of course, in a lot of these northern European countries, you have this, the fact that Iceland, Denmark, they don't even have any children with Down syndrome because they killed them all in the womb. So you have all of this history that is extremely recent. And here you have conservatives saying, oh, the liberals, they're the real Nazis. Oh, the Democrats, they're the real racists. They're the real eugenists. But yet right-wingers are praising a country whose head epidemiologist says, who cares if the elderly and sick are dying? And they're praising a country that has had eugenic policy, a huge history of eugenic policy, and didn't end it until the 1970s. What does that tell us about right-wingers? What it tells us is that underneath that shell of religiosity and Christian principle and Judeo-Christian values, there is a very elusive inclination towards fascism. And the fact that you can see little migrant kids in cages and not give a damn, that tells me a lot about you guys. It's pretty scary. It's pretty horrifying. And if some Swedish Germanic guy is tooting your horn and abiding by your own warped narrative, you guys would be the first to seek Heil. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. I don't think you guys enjoyed this video. But I hope you guys at least have learned something. Maybe I got you thinking up there in that warped brain. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.